I sent the message as she smiled at a table lit by crystal chandeliers, surrounded by champagne flutes and fake smiles. Her phone screen lit up, and in seconds her perfect world collapsed. I know everything. I know you're seeing another man and you threw away all our love. I just hope you're right in your choice. That's what I wrote. It was all she needed to read to run out of that gala dinner as if her life were on fire. But it was too late. When she walked through the front door, panting, her eyes filled with terror and her makeup smeared with sweat and fear, all she found was silence, and a letter. A sheet of paper with few words, but with the weight of a world collapsing: divorce. I was already gone. And in that instant, she knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The line that separates momentary desire from the destruction of an entire history. She tried. She tried with everything she had. She tried with tears, with promises, with memories of the past, with everything a repentant heart can vomit when it realizes what it threw away. She called me, wrote letters, sent videos, humbled herself. She said it had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment, a passing need. She wanted me to see that the love still existed. To remember everything we'd built. But how? How do you do that when you become a supporting actor in your own life story? When the lead role is given to another man, hidden in sheets that should have been yours, occupying a space that was your home? She wanted me to forgive, to forget, to start over. But she didn't understand, she didn't know, that some things, once they break, don't make a sound. They just don't come back. The cruelest thing about betrayal is that it doesn't just happen physically. It begins long before, in the small details, in the prolonged silences, in the averted glances. Betrayal is silent before it becomes scandalous. She betrayed me long before she opened her legs. She betrayed me when she started secretly checking her phone, when she started overdressing for trivial events, when she started laughing more at his texts than at my jokes that used to make her cry with laughter. I saw it. I felt it. But love has this curse: it persists. It tries to ignore it. It refuses to accept that it's dying even when it's suffocating. And I kept believing, until I couldn't anymore. The day I found out, I didn't yell. I didn't fight. I didn't confront. I just watched. Every step, every lie, every detail of the act she put on for me while living another story behind the scenes. She told me she loved me while deleting messages. She said she was busy while changing clothes to meet him. She kissed me after returning from absences she pretended were dinners with friends. I slept next to a woman who was no longer there. When I saw his message on her phone saying, "I can't wait to see you today," something inside me died with a frightening peace. I didn't cry. I just got up, packed my bags, and left. The letter I left was simple, but every word bled. I wanted her to feel it. I wanted her to read it and feel the same cold I felt every night I waited for her beside a bed that was no longer ours. I wanted her to see that I was leaving not because I no longer loved her, but because I loved myself enough to refuse to be second fiddle to anyone else's story. When she came home, she found an emptiness that not even the loudest scream could fill. And from that day on, she lived to try to fix what was already broken. She said she still loved me. That she'd never stopped loving me. That the other person was just a mistake, an escape, an illusion. She cried, trembled, wrote desperate texts trying to prove her regret. She showed up at my work. She waited at the door of my new house. She called my friends. She even tried to reach my mother. She wanted a chance. Just one chance. But what she didn't know is that when love dies from neglect, it doesn't return with tears. Love isn't elastic. It stretches until it breaks. And she broke ours with her own hands. And yes, I forgave her. I forgave not for her sake. I forgave for myself. I forgave so I could move on. So I wouldn't carry hate in my pockets. I forgave because I needed to free myself from the idea that I wasn't enough. I forgave so I wouldn't become bitter. But forgiveness isn't synonymous with return. Forgiveness was the final straw. And I moved on. I met someone. Someone who wasn't a consolation prize, but a reconstruction. A woman who looked me in the eye with truth, who laughed at my jokes without hiding her phone, who chose me every day. Meanwhile, she just watched. From afar. Trying to understand when she lost everything. Trying to understand why everything that was hers was now gone. And then, when we met again by chance, for the last time, she still tried. With teary eyes, her voice breaking, she said, "I still love you." And I just smiled. I touched her face tenderly, looked into her eyes, and replied with a calmness that destroyed her, "I forgive you, but I don't love you anymore." She lowered her eyes. She didn't cry. Because in that moment, she understood. She understood that the punishment wasn't the loss of her husband. It was the loss of love. The love she herself had taken from her own life, with her own choices. And there, for the first time, she realized that the cruelest betrayal wasn't the one she committed against me. It was against herself. Because now, even forgiven, she was just a memory of what could have been eternal, but chose to be fleeting. And what she lost, was precisely the only man who would have loved her forever. But there's something she never knew, something she's only just beginning to suspect. One final revelation. Something that happened that night at the dinner, when she set out desperately to try to save what she still thought could be saved. Something that might have changed everything, if she'd gotten there in time. Something that will only be revealed, when the full truth is told. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal, on the contrary, our stories show how it can destroy lives, families and hearts. All you will hear is fiction, but based on real emotions and choices, so you never forget, whoever cheats always loses more than they imagine. Get ready, you're about to hear a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Her name was Olivia, and even when she said nothing, her eyes spoke volumes. She had a calm beauty, the kind that doesn't scream for attention, but remains in the memory like an old photograph tucked between the pages of an important book. Her gestures were always gentle but resolute. She was a lawyer, respected in her field, a specialist in conflict mediation, a subtle twist of fate, considering what would come later. He, on the other hand, was Daniel. A cardiologist, accustomed to dealing with other people's hearts, but not always his own. He was a silent man, with measured speech and a deep gaze. He wasn't the type to seduce with words, but with presence. Between them, there was a story that seemed too solid to crumble, built on more than 10 years of coexistence, shared choices, silent promises, and a complicity built day after day in details no one saw. They met when they were still young, in a bookstore, by chance, late one afternoon. He was holding a copy of Tolstoy, and she was editing a paper with her cell phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. They had a light discussion about the ending of a book, and from there, a conversation blossomed that never stopped. Their relationship came naturally, and soon the two seemed a part of each other, as if they'd existed before they'd even met. Their connection was obvious to everyone. They weren't a couple who constantly displayed themselves, nor did they post daily photos on social media or publicly declare their love, but just watching them together for a few seconds was enough to understand there was something rare there. Something quietly intense. The wedding took place 3 years later, in a low-key ceremony in the countryside. No extravagant luxuries, just the most intimate details, and a celebration that was more about meaning than appearance. They lived the first few years in a small apartment, surrounded by unkempt plants on the balcony and books scattered throughout the rooms. They were happy. In a real way. Not the kind of perfect happiness seen in romantic comedies, but the kind that knows how to live with chaos, with the messiness of life, with the uncertainties of difficult times. They learned to support each other. When Daniel lost his father, Olivia slept on the hospital floor with him for 2 nights. When Olivia failed in a major case, Daniel cooked dinner and stayed up all night listening to her talk about injustices in the legal system. Over time, achievements came. Daniel established himself as a leader in his field, being invited to lecture and conferences. Olivia opened her own law firm and, with great effort, began building a solid team. They moved to a larger house in a quiet, leafy neighborhood, with a spacious porch where he liked to read on Sundays and she tended her orchids. They decorated everything together, discussing the placement of paintings, choosing colors for the walls, and gently arguing over which sofa would be the most comfortable. It was a full life, carefully constructed, where each achievement was celebrated together. Weekends were sacred. There was a silent ritual between them, leisurely breakfasts on Saturdays, with pancakes made by her and juice squeezed by him, followed by strolls through the local market or visits to the bookstore where it all began. In the evenings, shared wine, classic films, and long conversations about what they read, what they saw in the world, what they still wanted to be. On Sundays, the tradition of lunch with his mother, whom Olivia respected as a second mother, even with the small differences that time softened. In the eyes of outsiders, they had it all. And for a long time, they also believed they truly did. Daniel was a man of routine. He led a methodical, almost predictable life, but there was beauty in it. He cared for patients with empathy, returned home at the same time every day, and on their wedding anniversaries, he made a point of writing handwritten letters, mixing poetry and memories. Olivia, on the other hand, was more restless. Her mind was constantly on the move, always wanting to grow, to achieve more. She was intense, passionate about the causes she championed, but at the same time sweet in her company. Her passion for work never hindered her, as Daniel knew he admired it in her. They were, above all, partners. Even with busy schedules, they made a point of spending time together. Short trips, impromptu dinners, late afternoons watching the sky change colors through the living room window. The small gestures were constant. A message left on a post-it, a whispered compliment while she was putting on her makeup, a mid-workday phone call just to say, "I miss you." They both knew how to nurture what they had. And although, like every couple, they faced darker phases, they never let the stress build without facing it together. They were companions before anything else. Time, however, acts silently. And sometimes, changes don't come like storms, but like breezes that gradually cool the atmosphere. Daniel gradually became overly involved with the hospital, the extra shifts, the trips to conferences. Not out of escape, but out of vocation. Olivia began to dedicate herself even more to expanding her practice. Their nights together became rarer, their Sundays quieter. There were no arguments, no accusations. But there was absence. An emptiness that didn't scream, but weighed heavily. She began to seek meaning in new spaces. He began to accept the silence as normal. They continued to love each other, but in a different way. A love that no longer overflowed, but simply remained. Wedding anniversaries continued to be celebrated, but now with less enthusiasm. Letters gave way to quick notes. Saturday morning coffees became rushed. Movies were no longer watched together until the end. And despite all this, neither of them spoke. It was as if they were trying to keep alive a flame that was slowly consuming nothing but wax. Olivia smiled at events, Daniel accompanied her whenever he could. In public, they were the ideal couple. But at home, they shared more space than life. What held them together, however, was respect, history, and memories that seemed too big to leave behind. Every corner of the house told a part of them. Olivia's favorite cup, which Daniel bought at a market in Florence. The photo of the two of them on the shelf, taken on their 5th wedding anniversary. The playlist they created together for rainy nights. There was love, yes. But perhaps more longing for what they once were than passion for what they were now. Olivia spent more time at the office. Daniel spent more time at the hospital. Texts during the day became rare. Phone calls became formal. Their glances were still affectionate, but they no longer had the same sparkle. And yet, every night, he lay beside her and tucked the duvet over her. Every morning, she made coffee and set out his favorite bread. They were automatic gestures, but they were gestures nonetheless. The line between love and routine was increasingly blurred. Life went on, seemingly peaceful. Close friends still saw them as an example of a balanced couple. And to a certain extent, they truly were. Because balance, sometimes, is just the ability to stay on your feet even when everything inside you is shaking. There was, yes, a certain distance. But there was also hope. Hope that this phase would pass. That they would see each other again as before. That they would find their breath again. After all, everything they had built could not have been in vain. In that large house, with its porch illuminated by the morning sun and the scent of fresh coffee filling the air, Daniel and Olivia continued to exist side by side. Accomplices in silence. Partners in absence. United by memories, by old promises, and by a love that was still there, even if weary. What neither of them knew, however, was that some things were already changing inside. And that life, sneaky as only it can be, was about to test everything they took for granted. Everything they seemed to know about each other. Everything they thought was eternal. The weeks that followed were silent in a strange way, as if something were about to break but still insisted on remaining disguised under routine. Olivia woke up every day before Daniel, put the water on to boil, made the coffee, and left for the office without much time to talk. Daniel, in turn, left a few minutes later, returning at night exhausted, often with deep circles under his eyes and the smell of hospital lingering in his clothes. There were no disagreements, but there was also no touching. It was as if they lived inside a fishbowl, they saw each other, recognized each other, but never touched. The house was silent even when they were both present. A silence not of peace, but of distance. The kind of silence that swallows words before they're even thought. It was during a dinner with friends that something began to shift inside. One of Olivia's colleagues mentioned an important new client who had arrived at the firm on the recommendation of an old college friend. He was a well-known, discreet businessman who needed legal assistance with sensitive matters. Olivia didn't say much that night, but deep down, she felt flattered by the responsibility. Days later, she began conducting meetings with this client in person. The conversations, initially formal, took on different nuances. He was polite, intelligent, had a refined sense of humor, and a way of looking that always seemed to penetrate the surface. It wasn't overt charm, but there was something magnetic about him. She, in her veiled vanity, noticed the effect she still had. It had been a long time since she'd felt so observed. And perhaps, silently, she'd longed for it. Their first meetings took place at the office. Later, due to scheduling constraints, they began meeting for lunch at discreet restaurants, where they could talk more calmly. Daniel knew about these commitments, trusted her, and never even considered jealousy. There was something between them that had always been greater than doubt, it was certainty. But this certainty began to subtly crumble when Olivia began to dress more carefully. A new perfume, a bolder lipstick, lingerie discreetly purchased in bags that left no trace. And all of this was, according to her, simply a return to caring for her self-esteem. That's what she told herself every time her heart raced upon seeing his number on her phone. And that's what she said to herself when she answered texts in the middle of the night, laughing to herself about something she hadn't shared with her husband. Meanwhile, Daniel was beginning to sense something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Sometimes he'd watch her from afar, noticing her eyes were always too busy to notice what was going on around her. She no longer asked how his shifts had been. She no longer remembered the dates of his lectures. She seemed more absent, as if living in a different world. But she was still kind, still affectionate in a polite way. She still made coffee on weekends, but with less enthusiasm. Daniel, out of love or fear, chose to silence his suspicions. He wanted to believe it was just a phase, one of those inevitable curveballs every relationship faces. But inside him, something stirred strongly. An old restlessness that was now taking shape. One night, while organizing a closet in his bedroom, Daniel found a torn envelope with the name of a fancy restaurant. It was a receipt for a dinner, with 2 main courses, 2 glasses of wine, and a shared dessert. The date coincided with a night she had said she was at an office event. He didn't confront her. He simply saved the information. That night, he lingered in sleep, staring at the dark ceiling and listening to her breathing beside him, so light it was barely present. He wanted to ask. He wanted to touch her and tell her he missed her. But he remained there, frozen, suffocated by a doubt that grew like a knot. The days went by with apparent normality. Olivia maintained the same work rhythm, the same smiles, the same absences disguised as professional commitments. One of those nights, she returned later than usual. She said the meeting had run long. She smelled different, a masculine perfume lingering in her hair. Daniel noticed. But he remained silent. His silence was no longer one of peace, but of observation. He began to notice the schedules, the small slips in explanations, the averted glances. And yet, he continued to care for her. He prepared her favorite tea on a cold night. He left a loving note on her nightstand. But none of that stopped her. She was absorbed in another reality, in a place where he no longer belonged. The height of their estrangement came on a Friday night. Olivia was getting ready in her room with an almost rehearsed calm. She wore a dress she hadn't taken out of her closet in a long time. She applied her makeup with precision, sprayed perfume on her neck, and left, saying she was having dinner with clients. Daniel simply waved. And when she walked through the door, something inside him collapsed. There was no longer any doubt. It was as if, in that moment, love screamed in pain, but no sound came out. He stood there, motionless, with the still warm cup of tea in his hands, staring at the door closing behind her as if sealing a decision. That night, he didn't sleep. He called the restaurant listed on the old receipt and pretended to confirm a reservation. The attendant confirmed the name of the customer who made frequent reservations there, the same name that appeared discreetly in the messages she deleted. Daniel hung up and took a deep breath. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat on the couch and remained there for hours, feeling the weight of certainty crush everything that was left. The night seemed endless. At 3 a.m, she still hadn't returned. His phone was off. And in his heart, there was no more doubt. Only a sadness so deep it bordered on apathy. On Saturday, Olivia arrived home with an air of normality. She said dinner had been long, that everyone was in good spirits, that the evening had been a success. Daniel listened in silence. And then, when she went upstairs to shower, he went to the bedroom, opened the drawer where he kept his documents, and began writing. In less than half an hour, the decision was made. The letter written, the bags packed. The next morning, she came down for breakfast and found the house empty. Only the letter on the table, folded with surgical precision. She read it in silence. Her hands trembled, her eyes unblinking. It wasn't an angry letter. It was a farewell. Pain contained in every line, a dignified goodbye. And at the bottom of the page, a single sentence, I know. The days that followed were hazy. Olivia tried to contact him, but Daniel didn't answer. She sent messages, but none were seen. She wrote emails and sent audio messages, begging for a conversation, a chance to explain. But there was no more room for excuses. His pain had already become a decision. And his absence, now, was the exact reflection of the absence she'd cultivated for months. At the end of the first week, she went to the hospital where he worked. She waited for hours. She couldn't see him. She asked one of the nurses for help, who discreetly replied that he had requested a vacation. Olivia, in that moment, understood that she had lost more than she imagined. Not just her husband. But her ground. Her peace. Her stability. Her love. She tried to go to his parents' house, but was not welcomed. She called mutual friends, but no one knew where he was. Daniel had disappeared, and all that remained was the echo of what she had destroyed with her own choices. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, exhausted from so many attempts, that Olivia finally received a response. An envelope, left on her doorstep. Inside, a piece of paper with just 2 sentences. One that closed an era. And another that hinted at something more to come. I'm gone. But there's still something you need to know. It was raining heavily when Olivia finally saw his silhouette standing in front of the coffee shop where they used to meet years ago, when life was still made of spontaneous encounters and the world seemed small compared to what they felt. She hadn't expected to see him there, despite everything. She was shaking before even crossing the street, and each step felt like a ton. He was thinner, his face marked by time and the recent scars she herself had inflicted. But his gaze remained the same, steady, intense, with a calm that always disconcerted her. She walked in, and the silence between them wasn't awkwardness, it was presence. As if the space around them had ceased to matter. He didn't greet her. He simply gestured to the chair opposite her. She sat down without saying a word. She was pale, her eyes filled with anxiety and guilt. The world could have collapsed outside and she wouldn't have noticed. All that mattered in that moment was him. And what he still knew. For a few seconds that felt like minutes, he said nothing. He just stared at her like someone examining the void after a storm. Then, with the same calm voice as always, he told her he hadn't agreed to talk to hear explanations. That she shouldn't worry about justifying anything, because what needed to be said had already been understood in silence. But before he moved on, before he completely disappeared from what was left, she needed to listen. Not because he wanted to hurt her, but because the silence no longer held what needed to be released. Olivia, breathless, simply nodded. She was ready. Or so she thought. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers intertwined on the table, and began to recount what had happened that night she went to dinner with her lover. That same night, hours before sending the message, Daniel had had a difficult conversation with an important figure from his past, Olivia's mother. She had sought him out unexpectedly, saying she needed to talk. She knew. She had always known. From the first signs. And, despite loving her daughter, she had developed a sincere affection for him over the years, respect for the man who had always stood by Olivia's side with dignity. The encounter was painful. She apologized for not interfering, for remaining silent, for fear of hurting her daughter. He told her everything he knew. He spoke of the encounters, the disguises, the way Olivia spoke of her new friend, trying to hide the sparkle in her eyes. Daniel listened silently, but with his heart breaking. That was the trigger. Not because it was the first confirmation. But because hearing from her own mother that he deserved something better made him understand that he was losing himself trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. He then revealed something that made Olivia clap her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide, as if the ground had dropped from beneath her feet. He said that very night, just before sending the final message and leaving the house, he had gone to the old bookstore where it all began. The bookstore where they had met. He carried a letter he had written in the early hours of the morning, which he intended to deliver to her the next day, a final attempt at a fresh start. In the letter, he spoke of forgiveness, of rebuilding, of trying again. I still believed, that morning, that love could overcome fatigue. But upon entering the bookstore, she found something unexpected. The owner, a longtime friend of the couple, handed her an envelope. It said it had been left by a man, with instructions to deliver it to him if he showed up. The envelope bore Olivia's name, and inside were copies of messages, photos, and even audio recordings. Everything documented. Intimate conversations, vows exchanged, secret plans made. Betrayal was no longer a question. It was a stark, cruel, and cold truth. That was more than a blow. It was closure. Not of their history, but of hope. It was there that he tore up the letter of forgiveness. And it was at that moment that he decided to leave. But there was more. Something he'd kept hidden until that moment for protection, not revenge. He said that, days after disappearing, he was approached by the most unlikely person, his lover. A forced meeting, where the man wanted to clarify that his involvement with Olivia had begun on impulse, with no intention of destroying anything. He said she always spoke of Daniel fondly, as if he were a presence impossible to overcome. But, by the end of the conversation, Daniel understood everything. His lover didn't just want to justify himself. He wanted to rid himself of guilt. He wanted, in fact, to warn. He revealed that, on their last night together, Olivia had spoken about something no one else knew. Something she'd kept inside out of fear and shame. Something that explained not the act of betrayal, but why she'd hidden it for so long. It was then that Daniel looked into Olivia's eyes, now teary, his skin white as paper, his fingers trembling on the table. In a firm voice, he revealed the secret she thought she had buried with her decision to betray him. Months before everything happened, Olivia had been invited to a major international legal event. A conference where she would be honored for her work in family mediation. She was about to take the biggest step of her career. But that same week, Daniel had suffered a serious anxiety attack after a worrying diagnosis about his health, a genetic risk discovered late. He became vulnerable, fragile, and she gave up the trip, the award, the recognition, without ever telling him. She said the work had been postponed, that the event had been cancelled for external reasons. She made excuses. She preferred to care for him, to be by his side in his moments of weakness. And it was during this period, in this silent renunciation, that she began to lose herself. She felt herself being annulled by a man who didn't even realize how much she gave. She began to accumulate frustrations that turned into bitterness. That's when, emotionally weakened, she let herself be carried away by the other man. Not out of love, but out of the illusion of being seen again. Daniel fell silent after revealing this. Olivia was already in tears, mumbling apologies, trying to explain that she was scared, that she felt guilty, that she didn't know how to deal with the mixture of love and resentment that was eating away at her insides. She said she still loved him, that she never wanted to lose him, that everything was an emotional mess. But words, at that moment, no longer held any power. Because he already knew. And because now, she also knew that the love that still lived within her no longer found a place in his heart. He calmly stood up, placed a small box on the table, and told her that it contained the notes, photos, and letters she had written to him in those early years. Things he had kept for so long, trying to remember who she once was. He said he didn't want revenge. That he had already forgiven her. But he wouldn't return. That their love, once so beautiful, was now just a memory. And that sometimes, memories hurt more than absence. Olivia tried to hold him, but he only gently pushed her hand away. He looked at her one last time and, with a choked voice, murmured, "You lost me when I most needed to be chosen." Then he left, leaving behind the sound of rain beating against the windows and a woman completely broken inside, knowing that there, in that moment, she had lost not only the love of her life, but the chance to be, once again, the best version of herself. The box remained on the table for a few minutes after he left, as if physically weighted, pinning Olivia to the chair. Her fingers were still, tears streaming uncontrollably, and the sounds of the cafeteria faded into the background, giving way only to the echo of the words that still vibrated within her. "You lost me when I most needed to be chosen." That wasn't just a sentence. It was a deep cut, an irrevocable sentence. She hesitantly reached for the box and opened it slowly. Memories leaped out like specters, carefully folded notes, small cards from forgotten birthdays, a photograph of the two of them on their porch, smiling as if time were an ally. Olivia ran her eyes over each item, touching them as if she could turn back the clock. But nothing came back. And she knew it. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the cold remained. Olivia walked the streets as if aimless, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her coat, her body hunched as if trying to hide from her past. She passed the office but didn't go in. The employees were probably inside, working, believing the woman who led them was still the same. She wasn't. The betrayal wasn't just against Daniel, she had betrayed everything she believed herself to be. She had lost herself in her own choices, and now, with her eyes open, she saw the trail of destruction she had left behind. In the days that followed, she isolated herself. She didn't return calls, didn't see clients, didn't reply to emails. She would sit on the couch for hours, staring at the house that now seemed too big. His scent still lingered in the air, saturated with details she'd never noticed before. The way the paintings were positioned, the order of the books on the shelves, the mark on the couch where he used to sit. It was as if Daniel were still there, silent, reminding her of everything that was, of everything she'd lost. The nights were worse. It was then that the memories screamed loudest. She relived the moment of their conversation, the words spoken with devastating calm, his eyes, no longer filled with pain, but with certainty. The certainty that he was gone forever. It was only 2 weeks later, when she opened her phone for the first time in days, that she saw the message from Daniel's sister. It was short, direct, and carried more impact than any long sentence could have. "He's in Florence. If you still want to talk, go now." Olivia read and reread the message, her heart pounding in her chest. Florence. The city where they'd honeymooned, where he'd bought her favorite cup, where they'd gotten lost in the narrow streets without worrying about time. She grabbed her passport, threw some clothes in her suitcase, and left the next day without telling anyone. The flight was silent, like everything else in her life since then. Every minute on that plane seemed to bring her closer to a destination she wasn't sure she wanted. Part of her hoped he was still there, another part feared she'd find him and no longer recognize the man she loved. She arrived late in the afternoon, the sky tinged orange over the ancient rooftops. The streets were bustling with tourists, and the sound of street musicians contrasted with the turmoil within her. She knew exactly where to look for him. She climbed the hill that led to the bookstore where they used to spend hours together, the one where he had bought the book of poetry he read before bed. And there he was. His back to the window, watching the hustle and bustle, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on an undefined point. Olivia stopped, her breath ragged, her heart beating erratically. She approached slowly, as if any sudden movement might startle him. When he turned and saw her, his eyes showed no surprise. Only a serene weariness, as if someone had known this moment would come. She tried to smile, but couldn't. The words stuck in her throat. He watched her for a few seconds before saying quietly that he hadn't expected her to go so far. She replied that it wasn't she who traveled so far, he was the one who truly left. Daniel gave a barely perceptible smile and walked toward a nearby stone bench, sitting down. She followed him. They sat side by side, not touching, their eyes fixed on the horizon. He asked how she was, and her answer came back choked. She said she didn't know, that nothing felt right. That she felt as if she were living outside her own body. Daniel nodded, as if he understood without needing to hear much. And then, she asked to speak. Olivia talked about the choice she had made, about the night she decided to give in to the other man's approach, about how invisible she felt, devalued, exhausted from being merely a support, even though she knew it was unfair to Daniel. She spoke of her fear of appearing weak, of the guilt that consumed her for not being transparent. He said that during that time, he felt he had become unrecognizable. That he lost himself trying to find a self-love he might never have had. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting. He simply listened, his eyes fixed on the fountain gushing water in front of them. When she finished, perhaps expecting a reaction, anger, forgiveness, anything, he simply looked at her with an expression that blended compassion and farewell. He said he understood. That he wasn't there to judge, nor to reopen wounds. That he, too, had his share of absence. That perhaps the blame wasn't solely one person's, but rather the choice. And she chose the path that separated them. He said he didn't hate her, but that now he had found peace, and it was peace without her. He revealed that, during his days in Florence, he had met a woman who worked in a nearby cafe, and that, little by little, without intention, he began talking to her about books, music, life. A woman who knew nothing about his past, who didn't see him as the betrayed man, but simply as someone interesting. And it was in that simplicity that he rediscovered something he thought he had lost, lightness. Olivia felt her body freeze. She asked, almost in a whisper, if he was in love. He didn't answer right away. He simply said he was learning to smile again. And that, in itself, was enough. She looked down, her hands clasped in her lap, trying to hold back the tears that insisted on falling. She said she didn't want to get in the way, that she didn't expect anything more, but that she needed to ask for forgiveness by looking into his eyes. And that, even if she could no longer have him, she hoped he knew he was still, and always would be, the great love of her life. Daniel didn't answer. But his eyes said what words couldn't. He lightly touched her hand, as if sealing a cycle, and said that sometimes, the greatest act of love is letting go. When they said goodbye, it was without promises. Without vows. Just a long, silent look that held the entire history they'd shared and everything they'd never be again. Olivia walked the streets of Florence feeling a new emptiness, not that of loss, but of acceptance. And in that emptiness, perhaps she would begin, little by little, to rebuild herself. Alone. For the first time in a long time. Daniel, on the other side of the square, returned to the bookstore. He chose a new book, paid in silence, and walked slowly away, his heart light, his soul at peace. They both knew, with a certainty that no longer hurt, love, when betrayed, can even be forgiven, but it doesn't always survive. And what remained between them now was only respect and memory. Nothing more. The farewell in Florence seemed to have left an invisible mark on everything Olivia touched in the following days. There wasn't an open wound, but a constant absence, a kind of internal silence that permeated every moment of the day. The flight home was long, not because of the hours, but because of the weight she carried within. No other passengers around her seemed to exist. There was an entire landscape around her, but all she could see was the stone bench where she sat next to him, his eyes saying goodbye before his mouth could even confirm it, and his hand gently pulling away, as if understanding that love, however strong, must be released when it no longer finds space to flourish. It was a kind of pain that couldn't be resolved with regret, because the damage wasn't just emotional, it was structural. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had cracked from the inside out, and no matter how hard she tried to mend it, the cracks were now part of her path. When she arrived home, the same house that had once seemed full of life, everything felt strange, disconnected, as if someone had erased the colors and left only neutral tones. The plants were dry, the paintings seemed out of place, and the absence of sounds like the zipper on his suitcase, the creak of the chair he used to read, or the sound of the kettle whistling in the late afternoon made everything even more evident. She didn't allow herself to cry. Not because she had to, but because she felt the tears had already dried. What she felt now was a kind of grief that didn't cry. It was an emptiness that made her pace aimlessly through the rooms, touching the furniture as if trying to awaken dormant memories. But they wouldn't return. He wouldn't return. And reality no longer yielded to the comfort of fantasy. The days passed slowly. Olivia returned to work, even though the team felt her energy drained. Her eyes no longer held the same steady feeling, her voice sounded lower, and although she tried to maintain her rhythm, there was a disconnect between the woman who had led before and the one who now sat behind that desk. People respected her space, but they knew something had changed irreversibly. She knew it herself. And it was in this silent rhythm that she began to try to reclaim parts of herself, not with the hope of return, but out of a need to reconnect with what remained. She began to write. Journals, reflections, scattered memories. Everything she had experienced with him, everything she had destroyed, everything she still didn't understand. It was a painful but necessary process. Writing allowed her to hear herself, to confront truths she had previously pretended not to see, to understand that the betrayal had not been an accident, but a choice made in a moment when she had stopped focusing on what truly mattered. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his new routine, far from expectations, far from the pressures that had dragged him down for so long. In the city where he decided to stay longer, he began teaching at a small university, participated in volunteer projects, and gradually rebuilt a simple but meaningful life. The woman from the cafe became, unhurriedly, a constant companion. There were no promises, no urgencies, but rather a meeting between two people who respected each other's time. With her, he learned to laugh again, to walk without the rush of filling gaps, to share without the weight of the past. It was a relationship born of the present, not the need to erase scars. And that, for him, was enough. Even so, there were nights when, alone, he still thought of Olivia. Not with pain, but with the nostalgia of someone who recognizes they've experienced something profound, real, and that, however it may have ended, it didn't deserve to be forgotten. There were memories he held on to not out of attachment, but out of gratitude. And in those moments, he understood that the end didn't negate the value of the journey. Loving someone who betrayed him wasn't shameful, it was simply proof that he felt everything intensely. But moving on was his only way to honor that love. Olivia, for her part, watched her own story crumble into small details. The looks on people's faces, the unasked questions, the constant feeling of judgment. It was as if everyone knew, as if the walls spoke. And she began to understand the true weight of betrayal, not just losing the one you love, but losing yourself in the process. She began visiting her mother more often. The two didn't speak directly about what had happened, but their looks said more than words could. One day, her mother left an old album on the table, filled with photos of Olivia and Daniel. It was as if to say, you need to remember who you were before you lost yourself. And it was as she leafed through those pages that Olivia found herself confronted with a version of herself that seemed so distant, yet still breathed somewhere hidden within her. The photos didn't hurt. But they reminded her. They reminded her of the woman who dreamed big, who believed in love, who made choices with a light heart. They reminded her of the girl who still existed, even if buried under guilt. Life, as always, went on. Birthdays arrived, dates once celebrated now passed unnoticed. Time didn't stand still, and with it came new opportunities to rebuild or sink. Olivia chose to rebuild. Slowly. Without major changes, without promises. Just small steps. She began walking alone in the mornings, cooking old dishes he'd enjoyed, but now just for herself. She read the books they'd started together but finished alone. It was a way of rescuing and, at the same time, letting go. She no longer sought to know where he was or with whom. She understood that love remained alive in another form, but that his presence now belonged to another time. And accepting this was the hardest part. But also the most liberating. One afternoon, while organizing an old drawer, she found a notebook filled with plans they'd made together. Trips, projects, ideas for home renovations, even the names of children they'd dreamed of having one day. For a moment, she felt a lump in her throat, but instead of closing the notebook and hiding it, she began to read aloud. It was a way of closing, of finishing something unfinished. Each page turned was a silent farewell. And at the end of the notebook, she wrote in her own handwriting, "Thank you for being my home. Now I need to learn to be my own home." That same week, an old friend invited her to dinner. Olivia hesitated, but decided to go. It was a simple restaurant, a small table, some people she knew and others she'd never met. Among them, a man named Ethan. They chatted casually over dinner, and there was no immediate enchantment. But there was a calm exchange of glances, as if recognizing in the other's pain a similar story. He, too, bore scars. He, too, knew what it meant to start over. And it was in that silent recognition that something ignited, not like an urgent fire, but like an ember that can turn to heat over time. That night, when she got home, Olivia didn't cry. She sat on the porch with a glass of wine and looked up at the sky. She thought about everything she'd lost, but also about everything she'd learned. And for the first time in a long time, she felt there was room for something new to grow. It wasn't about forgetting Daniel, nor about replacing memories. It was about living with them. Using them as part of her story, but not as an anchor. Olivia knew she still had much healing to do. But she also knew the worst was over. And that, little by little, she was finding meaning again. And in that moment of silence, of light breeze, of painless absence, she understood that true redemption comes not when we are forgiven, but when we are able to face our mistakes, transform them into lessons, and move forward with dignity. And that was the choice she was finally ready to make. On that gray Sunday morning, Olivia woke unhurriedly, wrapped in sheets that, for the first time in a long time, were unburdened by memories. The sky, overcast and lazy, perfectly reflected the silent state of her spirit, neither completely at peace nor more tormented. She sat on the edge of the bed, her feet touching the cold floor, and felt something had subtly shifted. It wasn't a relief, but a serene acceptance. The love she carried for Daniel no longer ached with the same intensity, but it hadn't been buried either. It was there, present, transformed, perhaps, into something more mature and less desperate. A love that no longer demanded retribution, simply rested in unhurried memories. Days after the dinner where she met Ethan, they ran into each other again by chance at a small bookstore in the city. It wasn't rehearsed, nor was it symbolic. It was simply casual, real, as the good things in life tend to be. He was leafing through a novel, and she was absent-mindedly strolling past the philosophy section. When their eyes met, there was no surprise, just a smile shared between two survivors. Ethan invited her for coffee, and she accepted without hesitation. They sat at a table in the corner of the room, away from the hubbub, and talked for almost 2 hours. They talked about books, postponed trips, frustrations with routine, and dreams that still endured. It was a light, unpretentious conversation, but there was a depth between the lines that only those who have lost something important can grasp. Olivia felt comfortable, without the need to prove anything, without the burden of being perfect. She just was, and that was enough. The encounters began to repeat themselves. First on weekends, then during the week, sometimes by chance, sometimes with intention. There was no pressure, no rush. Ethan was different. He had a calm way of observing the world, a gentle way of listening that made Olivia feel like every word she spoke found a safe place. They didn't talk about the past. It was as if, instinctively, they both knew the ghost still existed, but they didn't need to be exposed at every moment. Mutual respect for silence was enough. With him, Olivia rediscovered small joys, cooking together, walking aimlessly at night, laughing at bad jokes, reading aloud from a book and discussing the meaning of each word. It wasn't overwhelming passion, it was patient affection. And that was exactly what she needed. But tranquility always hides emotional traps. One autumn afternoon, while tidying her closet, Olivia found an old coat of Daniel's. The scent was still there, subtle but present, and that was enough to trigger a wave of memories. She didn't cry. She simply sat on the floor with the coat in her lap and let her thoughts wander freely. She wondered what he would be like now, how he would have moved on with his life, whether he still remembered her fondly or had, in short, erased everything. It was strange to think that someone who was once everything could now live without you. And even stranger was knowing that the pain had passed, but left a scar that would never fade. It was the mark of a true love marred by circumstances and choices. That same week, Daniel appeared at a legal event in the city, invited to give a lecture on ethics and emotional responsibility in human relationships, a topic that seemed ironically connected to her own story. Olivia heard about this from colleagues and hesitated to go. But after reflection, she decided to attend. Not out of longing, but out of respect. The room was full, and he spoke confidently, his voice slow, his eyes attentive. When he saw her in the audience, there was a slight hesitation, imperceptible to others, but enough for her to know there was still a silent recognition there. At the end of the lecture, their eyes met for eternal seconds, and it was Ethan, standing beside her, who held her hand firmly, as if understanding without demanding explanations. Days later, Daniel sent a brief message, "Thank you for coming. It was important." She responded with a simple, "You deserve to be there." There was no further exchange of words. And there wasn't any need. It was the closing of a cycle that had demanded everything from both of them, but now ended with dignity. Olivia told Ethan about the event and about Daniel. She told him without fear, without hiding, and he listened without judgment. Afterward, he simply said that she didn't need to justify herself, that the stories we live shape us, but don't define us completely. And it was at that moment that she knew she was ready. Not to forget Daniel, but to love again. To love consciously, with maturity, with lightness. With Ethan. Their relationship progressed steadily. There were no daily vows, no long-term plans. But there was care. Ethan respected Olivia's silences, and she learned to trust his words. They began traveling together, exploring small places, far from the hustle and bustle. They rediscovered the joy of the new without the weight of the past. Olivia began to look at herself with more compassion, laugh more easily, and forgive herself a little each day. She didn't deny her history, but she was no longer held hostage by it. She began giving lectures on emotional ethics, mentoring young professionals on the impact of choices on their personal and professional lives. She became a reference not only for her competence, but for the truth that emanated from her words. People listened, and she spoke not with bitterness, but with the wisdom of someone who had been on the other end of the line and managed to come back. One day, while organizing old books, she found a letter Daniel had left inside a volume of Rilke's poetry. His handwriting, firm, unmistakable, began, "If you ever find this book again, I want you to know." And there was what he had never said aloud, that, despite everything, he had always loved her. That the mistakes were real, but so was the love. That his forgiveness was complete, but that he knew their cycle had ended so they could both grow. That he hoped she would be happy, with whomever she was, and that she wouldn't carry the guilt as a chain, but as an impulse to be better. Olivia read the letter in silence, her heart warmed. It was the most beautiful closure she could receive. Not for the absence of pain, but for the presence of love, albeit transformed. She put the letter in a box along with other memories, gently closed it, and placed it at the back of the closet. Not as someone who hides, but as someone who respects the time of each thing. And that same day, sitting next to Ethan in a small cafe in the city, silently observing the street, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, serenity. Because now she knew that, despite mistakes, losses, and scars, she had managed to find a new path. A path where love didn't require erasure, but honest construction. Where the past was a road traveled, but no longer the only direction. And in that moment, looking at him, smiling effortlessly, she understood that starting over wasn't a denial of what she'd experienced, but an acceptance that life sometimes breaks us to show us how we can be rebuilt with more truth. And so, without promises of eternity, but with the truth of conscious choices, Olivia embarked on her new chapter. Not to replace what she lost, but to honor what she had learned. And deep down, she knew this was the rarest kind of love, the one born after a fall, fueled by the courage to not hide from one's own flaws. She had been everything, lover, betrayer, abandoned, regretful, forgiven. But now, she was simply herself. And that, finally, was enough. Time passed as only time knows how, silent, steady, sometimes cruel, but always relentless. The seasons changed, the faces in the cafes were no longer the same, and the days no longer carried the weight of poor choices, but rather their definitive consequences. Olivia continued her life with the serenity of someone who has understood that what breaks sometimes cannot be put back together, but can be transformed into something new, perhaps stronger, more true. Her relationship with Ethan had become solid, but not without shadows. She carried within her a rare lucidity. She knew that happiness no longer came from enchantment, but from the awareness of who one is and what one carries. And Ethan, with his natural calm and patient gaze, understood this as few would. He didn't demand perfection, he didn't ask for oblivion. He simply walked alongside, offering presence, and that was all. One afternoon, Olivia received an invitation to a photography exhibition. The artist's name made her stomach churn for a moment. It was Daniel. He had returned to photography, something she had always encouraged, but which he had abandoned during the most turbulent years of their marriage. There was no resentment in his name, only a whiff of remembrance. Ethan encouraged her to go. He said she needed to close all the cycles that still breathed within her. And she went. The space was intimate, the lights low, music soft in the background, and the photographs, all black and white, showed glances, hands, silences. There were no poses. Everything was real, raw, sincere. In each image, she felt a part of him, as if Daniel had left pieces of his soul there, scattered among the frames. As she approached the last photo, she found herself faced with something that took her breath away. It was an old photograph of the two of them, taken without her realizing it, on a random day, smiling at each other as if nothing else existed in the world. The caption was a single word: forgiveness. At that moment, she realized he was there, standing silently a few steps away, watching her reaction. They didn't approach immediately. Their eyes met with the maturity of someone who no longer expects anything, simply understands. He approached her calmly, smiled sincerely, and said that this exhibition was his way of telling a story that was never written to its end. She nodded, moved, and replied that he had done it in the most beautiful way possible. They talked for a few minutes, talking about the present, about how life had taken different paths. Neither of them tried to recapture what had been. There was no more room for that. But there was respect, there was gratitude. Before they said goodbye, Daniel said that that photo was the only one he would never sell or exhibit again. It was theirs alone. And that, even with everything that had happened, it had been one of the great loves of his life. Olivia, teary-eyed, said that he had been hers too. But now, they were both where they belonged. There was no hug, no promise. Just a long look and a silent goodbye, like a full stop that no longer hurts. In the months that followed, Olivia decided to make a big change. She sold the house where she had lived for so many years, chose a new neighborhood, a new space, where she could start over without so many traces of what had been. She and Ethan moved in together, but without rushing. Every corner of the new home was filled with choices made together, free from the weight of the past. They began to create new memories, new routines, new stories. Olivia began writing frequently. Her reflections, previously kept to herself, became chronicles published on websites and magazines, touching people who, like her, had experienced loss, betrayal, and new beginnings. Her words spoke not of revenge or idealizations, but of reality, of the pain of making mistakes, the courage to start over, and the strength to continue loving, even after everything. Her name became associated not with scandal, but with authenticity. Daniel, for his part, moved again. He continued his photography projects, now traveling through small towns, capturing ordinary lives, stories few saw, but which he recognized as special. He met new people and loved again, in a different way. He never spoke of Olivia with resentment again. When anyone asked about his past, he would say he had a great love, which he lived intensely, which hurt deeply when it ended, but which was essential to becoming the man he was today. He understood that not all loves last, but true ones never disappear completely. He learned that forgiving isn't forgetting, it's freeing oneself. And that's exactly what he did. Ethan, beside Olivia, stood firm. He never tried to compete with Daniel, never demanded space he wasn't entitled to. He was present, real, constant. He loved Olivia with open eyes, knowing who she was and who she had become. And that made all the difference. One day, as they walked hand in hand through a book fair, Olivia stopped in front of an old copy of poetry. He smiled, picked up the book, and as he leafed through it, he saw a note hidden between the pages, handwritten by some stranger. It read, "To forgive is to love wisely." She read it silently, then handed the note to Ethan, who simply smiled and put it in his pocket. They didn't need to say anything. Time passed, and with it came new challenges, new achievements, but also the peace of mind of someone who has faced the worst and come out the other side intact. Olivia turned her story into a lecture. She traveled the country talking about self-love, mistakes, and new beginnings. Her speech was moving because it was real. She spoke neither as a victim nor as a heroine. She spoke as someone who had fallen, who had hurt and hurt others, but who had the courage to look at herself and change. Her journey inspired not because she was perfect, but because she was human. This is a story about how love, when left untended, can be destroyed by our choices. About how betrayal doesn't just affect the other person, but corrodes us from within. About how losing someone who truly loved us leaves a void that no fleeting passion can fill. Olivia and Daniel are reflections of so many couples who lose themselves in haste, routine, and a lack of communication. But they are also proof that it is possible to learn, grow, and move forward with dignity. Even if the end isn't together, it can still be beautiful. And Olivia discovered that, despite all the suffering, life can still be sweet, if there's courage to start over. Comment below what you thought of this story. Did it touch you in any way? Did it make you reflect on something you've experienced or are currently experiencing? Your opinion is very important to us. And if you're not yet a subscriber, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications now. There are many powerful and moving stories coming. And never forget, betrayal isn't just a mistake, it's a choice that destroys families, loves, and futures. Here on this channel, we don't support and never romanticize any kind of betrayal. Our stories are a warning, so that you never have to experience the regret that so many experience too late. May this story serve as a reminder, those who truly love care for, respect, and choose each other every day. Because love only survives where there is loyalty.